Good morning, everyone. Can I begin also by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any elders in the room today. And thank Colin Hunter for that wonderful welcome. I've heard Colin before and I always think he's a man of few words and lots of wisdom, so thank you very much. Could I also acknowledge Andrew Baxter, the chair of the foundation, Catherine Brown, other directors of the board that are here, other foundations. I've seen some people here that are here today, to friends, colleagues and guests. And it's also happy 95th birthday, I understand, as well. So I feel very honoured that you have asked me to speak today and that it's a lovely way to celebrate the fabulous work that the foundation does. When I was asked to think about doing this, I must say, when Catherine rang me, my initial reaction was, no, you've got to be kidding. You had the governor last year. It's like when I have to follow dynamic young people in my work, but then I thought about it for about 3 seconds and said, no, I always take up an opportunity where I can get a group of people, influential people, to listen to things that I have to say. So again, thank you very much. And then I wondered, when I had I think I've got 20, 25 minutes, where do I start on such a broad topic as inclusive and equitable communities? So what I thought I'd do is tell you a little bit about who I am and how the organisation I work with commenced, and then some of my thoughts about what philanthropy could do, because I thought they kind of fitted in together really well. So hopefully it makes sense to you. And it does get a bit personal when you tell your life story, but I've now discovered that it's often the best way for people to understand why I do the work I do. So I'm a child of Italian immigrants, classic as many migrant countries, children of migrants who came in search of a better life. I thank them dearly, because they've both passed away in the last 2 years, for the journey, their hardships and the associated grief that came to give me the life I have today and the many other people in this wonderful land that we live. I was raised in a really loving family, really working class suburb in the north of Melbourne. I won't tell you where. And you'll find out later when I tell a story. I don't want it to be declared where I was. I really didn't understand disadvantage and discrimination while I was growing up, but I knew I was different to other children in the neighbourhood where I lived. I went to school with very little understanding of the English language, had no books, very few toys, but happy. But I was completely petrified about the new world I was entering, which was school. On the first day of school, as I was walking with my mum, I met an Aussie girl, who also will remain nameless for the moment, who lived down the street walking to school with her mum. We became friends from that day. She taught me all things Australian, initially through food, things like lamingtons, apricot chicken, which you can imagine to an Italian family what that was like. And I introduced her to pizza and pasta and to my Italian family culture conditions, communion, all those Catholic Italian things. Our worlds were so different, but yet during those school years we created a social connection that was instrumental in building understanding of difference and fear of the unknown. Children rarely see the colour or difference in others or carry the prejudice of their parents. They see the wonder, the beauty of making new friends. That was me and my new friend. I was made to feel welcomed in her family and her extended community and events in that area, and she felt accepted by mine. It was only many years later as an adult that I understood how that experience had really helped me frame my understanding of multiculturalism. My experience is testament to that. I truly believe most Australians are welcoming and embrace their neighbour, and that Australians really value diversity, our multicultural history and reality. But an experience in high school many years later highlighted the prejudice and stereotyping that went with being a woman from a working class migrant background with ambitions. When asking my male careers teacher, and I'll say he was mid-traditional 19 kind of background, about doing a course in journalism, that's where I'd started at university, he replied sincerely, it almost makes me emotional when I talk about this now, why would you bother considering university? Instead, go off and do that secretarial course like all the other girls. We know what I discovered later what that was code for, those migrant or WOG girls, he called. But being stubborn, and those that know me would know I'm very stubborn and determined, I of course ignored his advice. Well, I didn't go to university to do journalism because I think in hindsight that experience was fundamental in my decision to move into what I suppose, is called the people profession, and I went off to be a youth worker. I must say, much to my parents' annoyance and disgust at the time, because they really felt, like most parents, that they want you to be a doctor or a lawyer. Many years later, they came to accept that kind of career, but at the time it was a real issue for someone like me to pursue that kind of career. And in light of that story, I have to tell you, sadly, still today, many of the young women I work with share similar experience in 2018. So yet we have gone so far, there are many things which we have not gone very far at all. So CMY, the organisation I was the founder of, and a group of other youth workers, were all children of migrants ourselves who had experienced similar prejudice or discrimination and wanted to make a difference in the lives of young people that we were now working with and create a better life for those that followed. So we started this support network. We were a very group of naive young youth workers in our early 20s who really wanted to change the world. And quickly we transformed ourselves from a support group to an advocacy group. So to cut that story short, I was fortunate after spending some time overseas. I went overseas back to Italy because, not feeling like I was Australian, I thought, no, I'm going to go back to Italy and I really am Italian. Well, like many of us, and this story is heard many times, I went searching of my true identity, and what I did, I returned home knowing that actually I was definitely Australian, but my heritage was Italian. It was a very important moment in my identity formation. So I got this job after that. So 30 years ago, there was no recognition of the specific needs of migrant and refugee young people in public policy, and it was a relative new concept, even though there had been lots of work done by people before my generation, particularly in the union kind of movement and others. But it was a time when Australia was coming to terms with accepting quite different migrants. So fundamentally, the reasons for the existence of CMY then, 30 years ago, haven't changed substantially, even though there have been major improvements to the kind of supports for young people. CMY today, and I won't spend a lot of time on CMY at this moment, but I'll reference that for those of you who don't know us, we've played, I think, a really important role in giving access to young people, to give them a voice, to stay at school, to get jobs, participate in sport, stay connected to family, divert them from the criminal justice system, and importantly, make them feel part of the Victorian community. As I said earlier, we know that multicultural Australia is celebrated and embraced by most, and we are a society that has been enriched. Multiculturalism in Australia has been fostered by the individual contributions of government, philanthropy and organisations in ensuring that we support those groups and programs that support communities in their settlement process. That investment in communities, organisations and structures has been well documented. I won't labour the point, but we all know that Australia has been identified as a success story, and that Australia's multiculturalism is very different to the multiculturalism of other Western nations. And part of that reason is because of the investment that's been made. We are one of the most successful nations. Victoria is one of the more harmonious states, but it is important to be remembered that that doesn't just happen. It is nurtured significantly by government and community. Which takes me to speak a little bit about the role of philanthropy and the role that philanthropy should play in addressing issues of equity, inclusion and disadvantage. I believe the role of philanthropy in this space is more important than ever, as we see a greater divide between what we might call the have and the have-nots in Australian society, and in particular Melbourne. And we see the increase in xenophobia and nationalism in this country. We know what's going on globally, so the importance of what philanthropy plays in Australia is fundamentally at the core of the kind of society we want to become. So let me just tell you, for those who might know, what life looks like for most of our migrant and refugee young people in Victoria. A wide body of research indicates that young people, and in particular migrant youth, experience a range of challenges and disadvantages in relation to their cultural identity and social economic status within mainstream society. These include, among other determinants, of poor education, unemployment, financial difficulty, incarceration, social inclusion, and can undermine social political integration in society and often lead to social problems. Over 36% of unemployed people in Australia are between 15 and 24 years of age. In some pockets of Melbourne, particularly in outer parts of the west and the southeast, unemployment for young people of refugee migrant background is as high to 40 to 48%. Young people between 20 and 24 who speak African languages at home have double those figures. Young people between 18 and 24 from refugee countries have lower levels of workforce participation than their Australian-born counterparts. Unfortunately, and I see this through my role on the Youth Parole Board, Maori, Pacific Islander and South Sudanese young people are overrepresented in the youth justice system. Families of refugee backgrounds are especially vulnerable to housing stress because of poverty and lower unemployment rates. Children from refugee backgrounds are more likely to live in a household with no car, and more likely to live in a household connected to the internet. Although there was limited research on the mental health needs of young people, in a recent literature search that we were part of, suggest higher rates of psychiatric disorders amongst this group than the Australian population, and that they could, information's unclear, face higher risk of suicide. But yet, despite these mental health issues I've talked about, young people from refugee migrant backgrounds don't access mental health services or youth mental health services in particular. This includes services like Headspace and others. So, in light of that, I do need to paint the picture that, of course, there are groups of young people that are doing quite well. We know that most businesses that a third of all businesses in Australia are run by migrant communities. There are groups of young people from some communities doing really well. So I don't want to paint a completely negative picture, but I think it's important to paint a picture that there are large numbers of young people from refugee backgrounds not doing well. Which I now want to share with you a little bit of research that we've been doing with Melbourne University and leading nationally, which we're calling the Multicultural Youth Australian Census. It's the first time a census has been conducted that gives us a comprehensive national account of how multicultural young people are faring in social, cultural and economic spheres of their life. So last year, 2,000 young people between the ages of 15 and 25 were interviewed. These participants came from 91 different countries, more than 3/4 were born overseas, and 45% were aged between 15 and 17, 25 were 18 to 20, and 30% were 21 to 25. I won't go into a lot of detail about what the report, but again, I want to paint a bit of a picture of what they told us. The findings paint a positive picture and show that refugee migrant young people are driven by hope and optimism, and I would say that that is what we felt before we did this research, and I think the research has indicated that that's absolutely true. 82% of the 2,000 young people we interviewed agreed or strongly agreed that they feel they belong in Australia. Half of those respondents were either unemployed or underemployed, and the reason cited why it was difficult to find work was racial discrimination. So despite almost half of this group having experienced some form of discrimination or unfair treatment in the 12 months, they really still felt like they strongly belong in Australia. It's a very powerful message, isn't it? So against this backdrop of belonging, hope and participation is a lived experience of discrimination and issues of unsafety. They identified diversity and discrimination as the most important issue facing Australia. They were given a range of issues to talk about: environment, education, job. These are the two that the bulk of those young people identified. So it seems counterintuitive, and it did for us when we're reading this from the research, that a large majority, 82%, express a strong sense of optimism and belonging to Australia despite the challenges they face. And I think that is what the work of CMY and those of us who work with these young people would share as well. And that in terms of what needs to be done around this issue, I think it's important that we start to live up to this image as the most successful multicultural society in the world. And that, not that many of you in this room would do, but those of us who have lived and seen through the African youth gangs issue in Melbourne would say that for a significant amount of time in the last 3 to 4 years, migrant youth in particular have been scapegoated for a reason of more profound issues of inequality that exist in the community. And that is not to say that I know there are issues to address. As I said, being on the Youth Parole Board, I'm acutely aware of what this issue is, but I also need to acknowledge that the whole media and political environment at the national level, I must say, I think there has been positives in the Victorian government, is a testament to this point. And one of the issues we're going to research again next year to see whether there has been a difference in the Victorian situation post the public image of what some of that research has been telling us. So hence, in painting that picture, not wanting to be overly negative, but I think it paints a mixed picture of what's going on in the Australian community and in Melbourne. I have seen historically the important role that philanthropy has played in addressing inequality. Philanthropic resources have funded the most innovative, cutting-edge programs than traditional government funds and have provided valuable seed funding for pilots that grew into multi-million-dollar projects funded by the government that had significant long-term impact. As you'll see some wise words, I've got some wise words of things that kind of guide my thinking. Words from Albert Einstein really ring true, which is about we cannot solve our problems with the same level of thinking that created them. That's why I'm thinking the role of philanthropy becomes really important. So I am going to be a bit self-indulgent because I have your time. I'm going to talk about 3 different projects that CMY has been involved in, which I think demonstrate this really clearly. So I'll go back way to the 1990s when I first got into this job. And there was a report that we commissioned called I Just Move Around and Around. It was a groundbreaking research into the experiences of homelessness for Vietnamese, Cambodian, Lao young people that was funded by the Maya Foundation. If there's anyone here, thank you. At that time, the government was not listening to our advocacy. We were telling them through our work that young people from these communities were experiencing homelessness. But we didn't know what to do. We knew we needed advocacy and we knew we needed to understand the extent of the problem. So the funding of that research by Philanthropy raised the profile of the issue, led to advocacy about their experiences of homelessness, which was quite different. Those groups of young people were living in each other's houses, crowded. The kind of terms we're hearing now about what homelessness looked like is what we discovered then. And of course, importantly, they were not going to youth homelessness services or centres. So what that report also helped to shape was to work with government to design culturally appropriate housing and support services and to reframe some of the policy settings. If we move more into the 21st century and talk about the issue of homework clubs, an issue very dear to my heart because we did a lot of work around investigating this issue around homework clubs. We knew from our work in the sector and with the community that homework clubs were in really high demand. There were so many young refugees entering Australia and struggling with education. They were sprouting literally all over Melbourne with little financial backing, often with really committed volunteers, but with very little skills, with no disrespect in this room, if anyone was one of them, in supporting ESL students. Many clubs also operating without OH&S standards or with any links to schools or the school curriculum. Philanthropy supported the documentations of these issues, the funding of the demonstration programs and a robust evaluation over a 3 to 5 year period. This investment led to the Education Department subsequently funding a statewide coordinated approach that ensured consistency, continuity and linkages with schools and financial support to the clubs. Without the long-term commitment by Philanthropy, this initiative would have not got up. And I'm also pleased to say through the Australian Communities Foundation and a range of other foundations, that work is being continued now, where we are supporting a coordinated approach to the way Philanthropy funds clubs to ensure that they're linked into all those measures and that they're meeting gaps, avoiding duplication and also important, maintaining quality standards. The last one I want to talk about, and the most recently, is probably one of the ones that I think we're really proud to be associated with, and is where our initial contact with the Lord Mayors came with, which was the whole issue of unemployment. I gave you an overview of unemployment figures. We knew that with the young people we were working with, and particularly African young people and young people from Pacifica backgrounds and refugees, that they weren't even getting a foothold in the employment market. So we knew there had been countless research done, but what we wanted to do was actually determine what was really going on. So through a partnership initiative with Lord Mayors, we funded some research through Melbourne Uni about what unemployment looked like for these young people, and more importantly, what should a support and pathway to work look for them. We kind of knew what the issues are, but we needed to look in depth at what was going on. So we developed what a model would look like. Lord Mayors provided the initial funding, and then I know Buckland, if you're in the room, Arias Trust and a few others came on board. So we got the project started. It would be close to 3 years ago now. We discovered 12 months into that project that some things were not going quite right. We wanted to change the model based on what we had learnt. I was really initially concerned as to how I was going to approach the funders and how would they, and more importantly, how would they respond, and would they see us as a failure? We had documented the process as part of evaluation, so we knew we had some data to back up what we were saying, and that we really wanted to restart the project. But you can imagine any other CEOs or NGOs in the room know that feeling of how do you broach this conversation. Well, I can say refreshingly, Lord Mayors and the other funders came with us on this learning journey. We redesigned the model. We were really not afraid to acknowledge that maybe we had failed or we had got things wrong. But we knew that it wasn't working and we needed to do something differently. We really appreciated the support to trial something new, knowing that we had made some mistakes and needed to change course. I think that was very brave on the part of the foundations and shows a leap of faith in our organisation. So thank you to all of that. But we now have what we think is an evidence-based model that is working. We have worked with over 50 young people in the last 12 months, most of them disadvantaged young people who could not get access to work, who are now either in internships, jobs or paid work experience. These were young people who had given up hope, who had been ignored by employment services and who just needed a pathway into work. We now have we've unearthed 70 volunteer mentors in the community who most of them had never mentored before. Many are either small business or from refugee and migrant backgrounds themselves who have given their time to connect with these young people. That has made an enormous difference. And they've supported those young people to either find work or to stay in a job, more importantly, because that's the other really important criteria, is not getting the job, it's actually staying in a job once you get it. And more importantly, which was our big plug to the board and which they endorsed this funding, was this was not just about us getting this model up, but what we're about is social change. What we want to do is share those learnings with government employment programs to say you're not getting right with these groups of young people, you need to do things differently, and this is what we're in the process of doing now. So, another one of my sayings that I think rings quote here, because Michelle Obama is one of my heroes, and this one I found when we were going through this process, was this all saying about that we shouldn't be afraid to be wrong, and I've had to learn to do that. I think that process has been really powerful for us to share, and I think the journey with philanthropy was fundamental in keeping that going. But again, it's really important to note, it's not that we went to them and said, hey, this has not worked. We had evidence, we'd had conversations, and we documented the process, so it was an informed decision. So I cannot emphasise enough the value of a partnership approach with philanthropy to the success of this program and many others. Government funding would definitely not have allowed us to trial, test and learn, then nevertheless trial, test and learn again. So these kinds of experiences had let me thinking about what is the role of philanthropy today. And through a conversation with Catherine, I came across this term around, is philanthropy the venture capitalist of the not-for-profit sector? So could they be the venture capitalists of the not-for-profit sector? That really resonated with me, so I am Googling, following through what does this mean, and it really resonates because what it made me think about, philanthropy has to be involved in investing in innovative ideas. They need to test, they need to scale up because that's how we lead to societal change. It's not going to happen from government. But this does require and I've had this conversation with a number of philanthropy organisations, it means you have to have an appetite for calculated risk. You can't continue to just back the winners, the ones with the loudest voice, the ones seen to be the hungriest, whatever. You need to take some risks on dealing with social issues that are reframing the society we're living in. Because, as I said, we cannot rely on government. I believe this to be a vital and significant role for modern day philanthropy. And that is not to say that I'm sure some of the philanthropy organisations are doing some of this. I suppose I'm saying there needs to be a new way forward, a new way of thinking. Melbourne is thriving, we've all heard about it, growing economy, growth, diversity, but those also bring societal challenges in a city that, until very recently, I felt was the most welcoming, but I am starting to question that in light of things that have gone on. Disadvantage and inequality is on the rise and increasingly concentrated in postcode pockets of Melbourne and rural Victoria. Philanthropy has to play a critical role in setting the agenda, the policy agenda, to ensure Australia continues to be that diverse and inclusive society. As I said earlier, it doesn't happen by accident. You can do this by many ways. These are some of the ways I suggest. Providing and funding the evidence base for informed discussion of public policy, because at the moment public policy is not informed debate, it's people's opinions. Government is not funding it, or research funded by government is to support the policy position of the government in power. We need to continue to have philanthropy invest in informed policy discussion. You need to continue, as you have done, to support the advocacy for voices of those individuals and groups experiencing poverty and disengagement. And you need to, of course, support not-for-profit organisations like mine and many other in this room who are working on behalf of these groups. So finally, I'd like to leave you with a few other ideas. I would really urge philanthropy to think differently about funding. I've alluded to some of that, and again, I think some of you may be doing this, so I'm calling for more of it. Could you fund organisations for purpose rather than for program? Because your program won't have achievements if you can't fund the infrastructure that goes with the programs and the people. Could funding be much more long-term investment in ideas, as I said, take some risk that create real social change and will mean that the kind of society we're creating is different? Facilitate further partnerships and brokering arrangements across philanthropy. Leverage those business networks. We unearthed a whole lot that we never knew were there before. There are people who want to connect but don't know how. The networks in your organisations must be enormous and untapped, and to connect them to us. And again, to create mechanisms, whatever they are, to actually discuss inequality of rights and access to resources, because they were conversations I was having in the 80s. They seem to have disappeared. We're no longer talking about what inequality means and looks like, because it looks different. And we're not talking about access to resources. As one of the many organisations in this room that work on addressing inequality, racism and prejudice, we want you to continue your work and we seek further partnership with you. Philanthropy does not replace government, but it is complementary. Philanthropy needs to be the agitator, a rational and independent thinker, and an advocate for those without voice. I certainly believe that the role of philanthropy as a leader is more essential today than ever before in my 30 years of work in this sector. There is a complete lack of leadership. The kind of work you will do, if done well and in partnership, will define the kind of society Australia will become. So in closing, to Andrew, Catherine, the Board of the Lord Mayors and all other philanthropic organisations in the audience today, thank you on behalf of the not-for-profit sector for the invaluable contribution you are making to the Victorian community, and we look forward to continuing work with you. Thank you.